In 1750, if you had asked a merchant in Boston, a planter in Virginia, or a printer in Philadelphia who they were, none would have called themselves American in the way we understand it today. They would have answered, with pride swelling in their chests, that they were British subjects, inheritors of the freest constitution on earth, protected by the most powerful navy afloat, and beneficiaries of liberties won through centuries of English struggle against tyranny. The colonies were not foreign possessions but extensions of Britain itself, populated by people who shared language, law, literature, and loyalty with the mother country across the Atlantic. The cultural ties binding the colonies to Britain ran deeper than political convenience or economic advantage, though both were substantial. Colonial children learned to read from English primers, absorbed English history as their own heritage, celebrated English military victories as personal triumphs, and mourned English defeats as collective tragedies. The educated elite quoted English poets, studied at English universities, corresponded with English intellectuals, and measured their own achievements against London standards. To be provincial meant to participate in metropolitan culture from a distance, not to reject it, but to aspire toward it, with the earnestness of those seeking validation from the centre of their world. Politically, the colonies operated as miniature Englands, each with its assembly modelled on Parliament, its legal system derived from common law, its political culture steeped in debates about rights and representation that had shaped British history for generations. Colonial legislators saw themselves not as subjects of an alien power, but as Englishmen exercising the traditional rights that belonged to all who lived under British law. The idea that these provinces might someday form a separate nation would have seemed as absurd in 1750 as the notion that Yorkshire or Scotland might declare independence from the Crown. They were British, proudly and completely, members of an imperial family that stretched across oceans and continents. The British Empire offered its colonial subjects something that no other imperial power could match in the 18th century: prosperity wrapped in protection, opportunity defended by overwhelming force. The Royal Navy patrolled shipping lanes that connected Boston to Barbados, Charleston to London, ensuring that colonial merchants could trade with reasonable security against pirates, privateers, and rival nations' warships. This maritime shield was not merely symbolic, but the foundation of colonial economic life, the invisible hand that made transatlantic commerce possible and profitable for colonists, who otherwise would have been vulnerable to every predator prowling the sea lanes. Trade networks that crisscrossed the empire created opportunities that colonists exploited with entrepreneurial energy that would have impressed even the most ambitious London merchant. Virginia tobacco found markets throughout Europe because British commercial treaties opened doors that independent colonies could never have unlocked alone. New England ships carried goods throughout the Caribbean under the protection of Britain's diplomatic reach and military reputation. The Navigation Acts, which later generations would remember as oppressive restraints on colonial trade, actually guaranteed colonial merchants preferential access to British markets and protection from foreign competition, in ways that made many fortunes and built many colonial cities. Military defense was not abstract theory but lived reality for colonists who remembered all too well the threats that surrounded them. French forces in Canada and Louisiana, Spanish troops in Florida, and indigenous nations who quite reasonably resented European encroachment all represented dangers that individual colonies could not hope to face alone. British regular troops and the promise of reinforcement from the mother country provided security that allowed settlement to expand, trade to flourish, and colonists to sleep without constant fear of attack. The empire was not merely a distant authority demanding obedience, but a protective parent whose strength sheltered colonial prosperity and whose prestige reflected glory on even the humblest provincial subject. The 7 Years' War erupted in 1756 as a global conflict that would reshape empires and redraw the map of North America in ways that no one, not even the most ambitious ministers in London or Paris, could have predicted when the first shots were fired. What began as frontier skirmishes between British and French forces over control of the Ohio Valley expanded into a worldwide struggle that consumed resources, toppled governments, and ultimately determined which European power would dominate the colonial world for the next century. The war touched every continent where European powers had established presence, from the forests of Pennsylvania to the plains of India, from the Caribbean sugar islands to the waters off the Philippine coast. Britain committed to total victory with a determination and expenditure that shocked even its own Treasury officials, pouring money into military operations at a rate that would have bankrupted lesser nations and strained even Britain's formidable financial resources to their absolute limits. Prime Minister William Pitt directed strategy with single-minded focus on destroying French power wherever it existed, subsidizing allies in Europe, while British forces struck at French colonies around the globe. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports, strangled French trade, and transported British armies to theatres of war scattered across the world's oceans. Colonial militias fought alongside British regulars in campaigns that pushed French forces back from the frontier, culminating in the capture of Quebec in 1759, a victory that effectively ended French rule in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed what the battlefields had already decided. Britain had won the most complete victory in the history of European imperial competition. France ceded Canada, abandoned claims to territory east of the Mississippi, and withdrew from most of its North American empire. Spain, which had foolishly entered the war on France's side late in the conflict, surrendered Florida to British control. Britain emerged from the war as the dominant imperial power, controlling an empire so vast that the sun never set on its territories. But victory came with a price that would prove more dangerous than defeat: a national debt that had doubled during the war, annual interest payments that consumed half of government revenue, and an expanded empire that would require expensive defense against enemies who were already planning revenge for their humiliation. Britain surveyed its magnificent new empire in 1763 with the pride of a collector who has just acquired the most valuable pieces in existence, only to discover that maintaining the collection costs more than purchasing it, and that some acquisitions bring more trouble than treasure. The national debt stood at an astronomical £130 million, a sum so large that contemporary observers struggled to comprehend its magnitude or imagine how it could ever be repaid. Annual interest alone consumed nearly £5 million, money that had to be raised through taxes that were already stretching British taxpayers to the breaking point and generating political opposition that threatened government stability. The new territories acquired from France and Spain required defence against populations who had no desire to become British subjects and indigenous nations who saw British expansion as an existential threat to their lands and ways of life. Pontiac's War erupted in 1763 as tribes across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley united in resistance to British occupation, capturing forts and devastating frontier settlements in a coordinated offensive that revealed how expensive and difficult governing the new territories would prove to be. Parliament responded by stationing 10,000 regular troops in North America at an annual cost of roughly £300,000, a permanent military establishment that dwarfed anything Britain had maintained in the colonies before the war. Ministers in London looked westward across the Atlantic and saw what appeared to be a logical solution to their financial crisis. The colonies had benefited most from the war that expelled French power from North America, so the colonies should bear some portion of the cost of their own defence and administration. The reasoning seemed impeccable to men who had never lived in America and who understood colonial politics primarily through reports from royal governors describing obstinate assemblies and ungrateful subjects. Previous attempts to raise revenue in the colonies through traditional trade duties had been undermined by smuggling so widespread that it amounted to colonial industry, suggesting that new approaches to taxation would be necessary if Britain hoped to make American subjects contribute their fair share to imperial expenses. The Stamp Act of 1765 was Parliament's first serious attempt to tax the colonies directly, and it detonated colonial politics with a force that shocked everyone in London who had expected compliance, if not gratitude, from subjects who surely understood their obligation to support the empire that protected them. The act required that printed materials in the colonies carry an embossed revenue stamp, from newspapers and legal documents to playing cards and dice, a tax so modest in rates and so English in precedent that its architects could not imagine serious objection to what seemed a reasonable contribution to imperial defence costs. Prime Minister George Grenville had even consulted with colonial agents in London before introducing the legislation, giving them a year to propose alternatives, receiving none, and interpreting silence as consent rather than the ominous warning it actually represented. Colonial reaction was immediate, volcanic, and unified in ways that previous disputes with imperial authority had never achieved, suggesting that something fundamental had shifted in how colonists understood their relationship to Parliament and the constitution they believed protected their rights as Englishmen. Assemblies across the colonies passed resolves, declaring that only their own elected representatives could impose taxes, invoking principles of consent and representation that had been sacred to English liberty since at least the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Mobs calling themselves Sons of Liberty destroyed stamped paper, terrorized stamp distributors into resignation, and effectively nullified the act through popular resistance that made enforcement impossible without military force that Britain was unwilling to deploy on that scale. What shocked London most was not the violence, though that was troubling enough, but the constitutional argument colonists advanced with surprising sophistication and unity, that taxation without representation violated the fundamental compact between governors and governed that made British liberty the envy of the world. Colonial pamphleteers argued that virtual representation, the theory that all British subjects were represented in Parliament regardless of whether they voted, was a dangerous fiction that would reduce Americans to the status of slaves subject to arbitrary power. Parliament, bewildered by resistance to what it considered fair taxation, repealed the Stamp Act in 1766 under pressure from British merchants suffering from colonial boycotts, but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a constitutional claim that resolved nothing while storing up future conflict between incompatible understandings of imperial sovereignty. Benjamin Franklin stood before Parliament in 1766 as the most famous American of his age, a man whose scientific achievements had earned him fellowship in the Royal Society, whose wit and wisdom had made him welcome in London's most distinguished salons, and whose commitment to the empire seemed beyond question to everyone who knew his writings and his long residence in England as colonial agent for several provinces. He testified with careful precision about colonial objections to the Stamp Act, explaining that Americans distinguished between external taxes on trade, which they accepted as part of Parliament's authority to regulate commerce, and internal taxes imposed without their consent, which they considered violations of their rights as British subjects, entitled to the same constitutional protections as any resident of Manchester or Birmingham. Franklin's testimony reflected a broader belief among moderate colonists that the crisis between Britain and America resulted from misunderstanding rather than irreconcilable principles, that reasonable men on both sides of the Atlantic could find accommodation if only they approached the problem with good faith and willingness to recognize legitimate concerns. He and men like him believed deeply that the empire could be reformed from within, that Parliament could be persuaded to recognize colonial rights to self-taxation through their own assemblies, while maintaining its authority over matters of trade and foreign policy. The imperial constitution, in their view, was flexible enough to accommodate colonial autonomy in domestic matters while preserving the unity that made the empire strong and colonists proud of their British identity. This vision of reformed empire required trust on both sides, a willingness from Parliament to accept limits on its theoretical sovereignty in exchange for colonial loyalty and cooperation, and a commitment from colonists to remain within an imperial system that respected their rights while still directing their external affairs. Franklin spent years in London pursuing this compromise with the patience of someone who believed that reason and goodwill could overcome political obstacles if given sufficient time and effort. He corresponded with ministers, published pamphlets, attended meetings, always arguing that Britain and America needed each other, that their interests aligned far more than they conflicted, and that separation would be catastrophic for both. His tragedy, and the tragedy of moderates like him, was that events would move faster than persuasion, that crises would escalate beyond the control of reasonable voices, and that the space for compromise would narrow with each confrontation until men who had sought reform found themselves forced to choose revolution. Distance was not merely geographic inconvenience, but a fundamental problem that poisoned communication between Britain and America, turning minor disputes into major crises because news travelled at the speed of sailing ships and decisions were made on the basis of information that was months out of date by the time it arrived. A letter from Boston to London took 6 to 8 weeks if weather and winds cooperated, longer if they did not, meaning that by the time Parliament learned of colonial reactions to its policies and could respond, the situation in America had already evolved in ways that made the response obsolete or counterproductive. Officials on both sides of the Atlantic made decisions based on their best understanding of circumstances that no longer existed, creating a cascading series of miscalculations as each side reacted to outdated information about the other's intentions. Pride amplified every misunderstanding because neither side could admit uncertainty without appearing weak to domestic audiences that demanded confidence and strength from their leaders. Whether those leaders sat in Parliament or colonial assemblies, British ministers could not acknowledge that colonial objections might have constitutional merit without suggesting that Parliament had acted unjustly, a concession that would have undermined their political authority and invited opposition attacks at home. Colonial leaders could not back down from claims of rights violation without appearing to betray principles they had articulated in the most absolute terms, losing credibility with constituencies that were watching every move for signs of cowardice or compromise with tyranny. Both sides found themselves trapped by their own rhetoric, unable to moderate positions without seeming to surrender core principles. Poor communication meant that decisions were made on the basis of rumour, assumption, and worst-case interpretation of ambiguous actions, creating a spiral of mutual suspicion that became self-fulfilling as each side assumed the worst about the other's intentions and acted accordingly. British officials interpreted colonial resistance as the work of radical agitators, manipulating ignorant mobs, rather than genuine popular opposition to policies that colonists found genuinely objectionable. Colonial leaders interpreted every British action as part of a deliberate conspiracy to reduce Americans to slavery, rather than the often incompetent and contradictory attempts by Parliament to solve genuine problems of imperial administration and finance. What might have been resolved through patient negotiation in a world of instant communication instead escalated through a series of misunderstood gestures and delayed responses until small quarrels accumulated into chasms too wide for even the most moderate voices to bridge. The American Revolution's most inconvenient truth is that most colonists never wanted independence, and many actively opposed it even after independence was declared, choosing loyalty to Britain over rebellion with convictions as sincere and principled as any patriot's commitment to liberty. These loyalists were not cowards or opportunists, though patriot propaganda painted them as such, but neighbours, friends, and family members who looked at the same political situation and reached different conclusions about where safety, prosperity, and justice lay. They saw in British rule not tyranny but order, not oppression but protection, not slavery but the most extensive liberty that any people in the 18th century enjoyed under any government on earth. Loyalism was strongest among those who had most to lose from the collapse of imperial order, royal officials whose positions depended on the crown, Anglican clergy whose church was established by British law, merchants whose businesses relied on trade within the imperial system, and wealthy landowners who feared that revolution would unleash social chaos that would threaten property and hierarchy. But loyalty was not merely self-interest dressed in political principle. Many ordinary farmers, artisans, and labourers remained loyal from genuine conviction that rebellion against legitimate authority was morally wrong, that the risks of independence far outweighed any grievances against Parliament, and that the empire offered better prospects for their futures than an uncertain experiment in republican government that might collapse into anarchy or dictatorship. The revolution divided communities and families with a cruelty that civil wars always inflict on societies where neighbours must choose sides against each other and live with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. Brothers fought on opposite sides, fathers disowned sons who made different political calculations, lifelong friendships shattered over questions of loyalty and liberty that admitted no middle ground once violence began. Loyalists faced violence from patriot committees that enforced conformity through intimidation, faced confiscation of property by revolutionary authorities, faced exile from homes they had built over generations because their political judgment differed from those who controlled militia and local government. The tragedy of the Loyalists reminds us that the revolution was not a unified people rising against oppression, but a deeply divided society torn apart by irreconcilable visions of legitimate government, with the winners writing history that obscured how uncertain the outcome was and how many Americans never accepted independence even after it became reality. The Boston Massacre of 1770 was less a massacre than a tragic collision between occupying soldiers and hostile crowds, but the name stuck because it captured how patriots wanted the event remembered, and because propaganda mattered more than precision in shaping political narratives that would justify resistance and radicalize fence-sitters into choosing sides. British troops stationed in Boston to enforce customs collection and maintain order found themselves targets of daily harassment from a population that resented their presence as visible symbol of military occupation, leading to escalating tensions that erupted on March 5th when soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists and wounding others in circumstances that remain disputed to this day. Paul Revere's engraving of the massacre, circulated throughout the colonies, showed disciplined British troops firing in formation into a peaceful crowd on their officer's command, an image that bore little relationship to the chaotic confrontation that witnesses actually described, but that perfectly served patriot purposes by depicting British authority as inherently murderous and Americans as innocent victims of tyrannical violence. The fact that John Adams defended the soldiers in court and secured acquittals for most of them on grounds of self-defense demonstrates that even patriots recognized the incident was more complex than their propaganda suggested. But complexity and nuance made poor recruiting tools for a movement that needed clear villains and heroes to mobilize popular support for resistance that required personal sacrifice and risk. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was likewise a carefully stage-managed act of defiance, designed to force confrontation while controlling its symbolism, as colonists disguised as Mohawks destroyed East India Company tea to protest the Tea Act in ways calculated to make a political statement while avoiding the appearance of common criminality. The destruction of property worth £10,000 shocked British officials, not because of the economic loss, but because it represented organised defiance of parliamentary authority by respectable citizens rather than spontaneous mob. Violence that could be dismissed as the work of rabble. Parliament interpreted the Tea Party as proof that Massachusetts had descended into anarchy, requiring stern punishment to restore order, while colonists saw it as justified resistance to unconstitutional taxation, and both sides' perceptions were distorted by their determination to see the event through ideological frames that confirmed their existing beliefs about the other's intentions and character. King George III was not the tyrant that American propaganda painted, but his personal stubbornness and limited imagination transformed what might have remained a manageable dispute over taxation and representation into an existential crisis that destroyed Britain's first empire and created a new nation that would eventually eclipse British power. The king was dutiful, pious, committed to his understanding of constitutional monarchy, and utterly convinced that sovereignty was indivisible, that any concession to colonial demands would unravel parliamentary supremacy and reduce the crown to impotence before subjects who would learn they could defy legitimate authority without consequences. His inflexibility came not from cruelty but from principle, though the distinction mattered little to colonists on the receiving end of policies that seemed designed to reduce them to slavery regardless of the king's personal motivations. Parliament itself was paralysed by factions that agreed on little, except that colonial resistance required some response, though they could never agree on what response would be effective, or even what the fundamental problem was that needed solving. The ministry led by Lord North stumbled from expedient to expedient, repealing taxes that provoked too much resistance, while asserting principles that guaranteed future conflicts, satisfying neither those who wanted firm suppression of colonial defiance nor those who advocated accommodation and reform of imperial governance. Edmund Burke and William Pitt argued eloquently for recognizing colonial rights and accepting limitations on parliamentary sovereignty in America, warning that attempting to rule colonists by force would bankrupt the Treasury and corrupt British liberty itself. But their wisdom was drowned out by members who saw colonial resistance as inexcusable defiance, requiring punishment to maintain imperial credibility. British political leaders consistently underestimated colonial resolve because they could not imagine that provincial subjects scattered across 3,000 miles of coastline could sustain organized resistance against the most powerful military force in the world, and they persistently overestimated loyalist strength because they wanted to believe that most Americans remained faithful to the Crown and that rebellion was the work of a radical minority intimidating the silent majority. These miscalculations led Parliament to adopt policies calibrated for punishing and isolating Massachusetts, while assuming that other colonies would remain passive, when in fact the coercive acts united the colonies in common cause and pushed moderates toward radicalism more effectively than any patriot pamphlet could have achieved. London's failure was not lack of power, but failure of imagination. Inability to recognize that colonists meant what they said about rights and representation. That distance and different circumstances had created a political culture in America that would resist subordination no matter what force Britain applied, and that the empire's strength could not compensate for policies that violated colonists' understanding of legitimate government. The radicalization of colonial politics happened gradually and then suddenly, as institutions created for coordination and protest evolved into shadow governments that displaced royal authority. While still claiming to operate within the bounds of the British Constitution, they insisted they were defending. Committees of correspondence, initially formed to share information between colonial assemblies about British policies and coordinate responses, became networks for organizing resistance that bypassed official channels and created communication systems that royal governors could neither control nor suppress. These committees connected radical leaders across colonies in ways that had never existed before, allowing them to coordinate boycotts, share tactics, distribute propaganda, and present unified colonial responses that made British divide and conquer strategies ineffective. Pamphlets flooded colonial cities with arguments that grew increasingly sophisticated and radical as writers pushed beyond objections to specific taxes toward fundamental questions about the nature of political authority and the rights of peoples to resist governments that violated their liberty. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, crystallized arguments that had been developing for years, making the case for independence in plain language that bypassed learned constitutional debates to appeal directly to common understanding of justice and self-interest. The pamphlet became a sensation not because it introduced new ideas, but because it articulated what many colonists had come to feel, but had not yet dared to say openly, that monarchy itself was illegitimate, that reconciliation with Britain was impossible, and that America's future lay in republican independence rather than continued subordination to an empire that would never respect colonial rights. Militia training transformed from occasional muster for defense against indigenous raids into regular drilling that prepared colonists for military confrontation with British forces, creating an armed population capable of resistance that gave teeth to political defiance and made royal governors increasingly irrelevant in provinces where they could no longer enforce their authority without military support that Britain was slow to provide. The transformation from protest to movement happened through thousands of local decisions, as colonists chose to attend committee meetings, sign non-importation agreements, join militia companies, and read pamphlets that increasingly described British policy not as mistakes to be corrected, but as evidence of systematic conspiracy to reduce Americans to slavery. Each small act of resistance normalized further resistance, creating momentum toward confrontation that became increasingly difficult to reverse, as colonists invested their reputations, their property, and eventually their lives in opposition to imperial authority. The Olive Branch Petition represented the Continental Congress's final attempt to find a path back from the brink of total rupture a desperate appeal to King George III to intervene personally to resolve disputes between Parliament and colonies before armed conflict made reconciliation impossible. Drafted in July 1775, after Lexington and Concord had already spilled blood, but before either side had fully committed to viewing the conflict as irreconcilable war, the petition professed colonial loyalty to the Crown, while blaming evil ministers for policies that violated colonial rights and begging the king to broker a settlement that would restore harmony within the empire. The language was humble, almost obsequious, reflecting genuine desire among most delegates to avoid the catastrophic step of declaring independence, if any alternative remained that could preserve colonial rights within the imperial framework. King George refused even to receive the petition, a rejection that signalled more clearly than any proclamation that the door to reconciliation had closed from the British side, and that the king viewed colonial resistance not as loyal subjects' legitimate grievances, but as rebellion, requiring military suppression. In August 1775, before the Olive Branch petition could reach London, the king issued a proclamation of rebellion, declaring the colonies in a state of insurrection and ordering officials to suppress resistance by force, effectively treating Americans as enemies rather than subjects, and making any negotiated settlement politically impossible for a monarch who had staked his authority on colonial submission. Parliament followed with the Prohibitory Act closing all colonial ports and declaring American ships lawful prizes, an economic declaration of war that treated the colonies as foreign enemies while still claiming they were rebellious subjects, a logical contradiction that revealed how thoroughly British policy had collapsed into incoherence. The rejection of the Olive Branch petition destroyed the moderate position that had dominated Congress through 1775 and vindicated radicals who had argued that Britain would never voluntarily recognize colonial rights, that reconciliation was a fantasy that only delayed the inevitable choice between submission and independence. Delegates who had genuinely hoped for accommodation found their position undermined by British intransigence more effectively than any radical argument could have achieved, pushing Congress toward independence not from desire, but from recognition that Britain had foreclosed all alternatives. The point of no return was not a moment, but a process. And the Olive Branch petition's rejection marked the moment when that process became irreversible, when even moderates recognized that the empire they had loved was gone, replaced by a government that would rather destroy the colonies than compromise with subjects who demanded treatment as free Englishmen rather than conquered provinces. Independence was declared in July 1776, not because Americans had spent years plotting to create a new nation, but because 13 months of warfare had eliminated every alternative, leaving Congress to formalize a separation that events had already accomplished. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia that summer to debate whether to break all ties with Britain were not visionaries eagerly embracing a revolutionary future, but exhausted men who recognized that reconciliation had become impossible, and that continuing to fight while claiming loyalty to the Crown was a fiction that served no purpose except to confuse colonial populations about what they were actually fighting for and dying to achieve. The decision divided even the Patriot leadership, with men like John Dickinson arguing to the last moment that declaring independence would make negotiated settlement impossible and leave America fighting alone against British power without any possibility of returning to the empire if the war went badly, while radicals like John Adams countered that Americans were already fighting for independence, whether they formally declared it or not, and that only a clear statement of separation would allow Congress to seek foreign alliances and unite colonial populations behind a cause worth the sacrifices that resistance required. The debate was agonizing precisely because both sides had legitimate arguments and because everyone understood that declaring independence was irreversible, that signing the declaration would make them all traitors in British law, subject to execution if the rebellion failed. The vote, when it finally came, was less enthusiastic embrace of Republican ideals than recognition that circumstances had foreclosed all other options, and that fighting for independence at least offered the possibility of victory, while fighting for reconciliation with a complaisant king who had declared them rebels could only end in submission or annihilation. Thomas Jefferson's draft declaration provided the philosophical framework that transformed a defensive war into a revolutionary cause. grounding American independence, not in specific disputes over taxation, but in universal principles about natural rights and government by consent that would resonate far beyond the immediate conflict. But the fact remained that independence was declared because it had become unavoidable, because Britain had responded to every colonial appeal with force rather than negotiation, because the King and Parliament had made clear they would accept nothing less than complete colonial submission, leaving Americans with a choice between fighting for independence or accepting permanent subordination to a government that had lost all legitimacy in colonial eyes. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia understood that they were signing what might become their own death warrants, committing treason against the most powerful empire on earth, with no guarantee that their rebellion would succeed, and knowing that failure would mean execution, confiscation of property, and disgrace for their families. Benjamin Franklin's famous quip that they must all hang together, or surely they would all hang separately, captured the gallows humor of delegates who grasped the magnitude of their decision and the impossibility of retreat once the Declaration was published and their names were attached to it for all the world and British authorities to see. Many signers viewed independence not as glorious triumph, but as tragic necessity, the collapse of all attempts at reconciliation that they had genuinely pursued, with hope that the empire could be preserved through reform rather than destroyed through rebellion. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that future generations would celebrate Independence Day with festivities and fireworks, but he confessed his own feelings were closer to anxiety than joy, recognizing that declaring independence was the easy part, while actually achieving it would require years of war against forces far superior to anything Americans could field. The personal costs weighed heavily on men who were not professional revolutionaries but lawyers, merchants, and planters who had been drawn into rebellion by circumstances beyond their control and by principles they could not abandon without betraying everything they believed about liberty and legitimate government. The revolution demanded extraordinary sacrifices from its leaders that history often forgets in celebrating their heroism. Families separated for years, businesses abandoned or destroyed, property confiscated or plundered, reputations attacked by loyalists who considered them traitors rather than heroes, and always the knowledge that British victory would mean not just political defeat, but personal destruction. Several signers lost fortunes, saw their homes burned, had family members imprisoned or killed, and spent their final years impoverished by the costs of supporting a revolution that consumed their resources while offering little compensation in return. They became revolutionaries reluctantly, stayed revolutionaries through necessity, and many died revolutionaries who wondered whether the experiment they had launched would survive long enough to justify the sacrifices that independence had demanded from them, and from countless others whose names would never be remembered in histories that celebrated victories while glossing over the staggering human costs of achieving them. Britain's military response to the Declaration of Independence was overwhelming in its force and terrifying in its implications for what defeat would mean to Americans who had now committed themselves irrevocably to separation. General William Howe commanded the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled, with 30,000 troops, including 8,000 Hessian mercenaries hired from German princes, because Britain lacked sufficient soldiers of its own to conquer rebellious provinces while defending all other imperial possessions around. The Globe. The fleet that transported this army represented British naval supremacy that colonists could not hope to match, giving British forces mobility and logistical support that dwarfed anything Washington could provide to his ragtag continental army. The New York campaign of 1776 demonstrated both British military superiority and American desperation, as Washington's forces were repeatedly defeated and driven from position after position until they were in full retreat across New Jersey, with the Continental Army disintegrating through desertion and expired enlistments that left Washington with barely a few thousand troops still under his command. British officials in London began planning how to administer the colonies once rebellion was suppressed, discussing which ringleaders would face execution and which might be pardoned, how to reorganize colonial government to prevent future resistance, and what level of military occupation would be required to maintain order among a conquered population that had proven itself dangerous when left with too much autonomy. The calculated ruthlessness of British military operations during this period reinforced that this was no longer a dispute within an imperial family, but a war of conquest, where mercy was scarce and punishment for rebellion would be severe. For those who had defied legitimate authority and raised arms against the crown, British and Hessian troops burned towns, plundered farms, treated civilians with cruelty that turned fence-sitters into patriots, and convinced even loyalists that British victory might not bring the restoration of order they hoped for, but rather military occupation that would punish loyal and rebel alike. The Empire struck back with overwhelming force, and Americans learned that they were fighting not just for abstract principles of liberty, but for survival against power that would show little mercy to those who had dared to challenge British sovereignty and claim the right to govern themselves without imperial control. The Loyalists who remained faithful to Britain through the Revolution paid a price that patriot histories often ignore or minimize, suffering persecution, exile, and dispossession for making the same kinds of principled political choices that patriots claimed to be fighting to protect, but applied selectively to those whose principles aligned with revolutionary cause. As patriot committees and militias gained control of colonial governance, Loyalists faced increasingly systematic persecution that began with social ostracism and escalated to violence, property confiscation, and forced exile for those who refused to abandon their allegiance to the crown or support the rebellion through oaths, taxes, and military service. Entire Loyalist communities were uprooted during and after the war, with tens of thousands fleeing or being expelled from the new United States to resettle in Canada, the Caribbean, or Britain itself, leaving behind property that revolutionary governments confiscated and sold to finance the war effort and reward patriots who had supported independence. Families that had lived in America for generations found themselves stateless refugees, depending on British charity and government assistance to rebuild lives in foreign territories where they were often unwelcome and viewed with suspicion by established populations who resented the burden of supporting exiles who had backed the losing side in a civil war. The fate of the Loyalists proved how ununited the colonies actually were, how much the revolution was not a people rising together against oppression, but a society torn apart by civil war, where neighbours chose different sides based on principles, interests, and calculations that seemed equally valid to those who made them, but led to irreconcilable political positions once violence made compromise impossible. Perhaps a third of colonists supported independence actively, another third remained loyal to Britain or sympathised with loyalist positions, and the remainder tried to avoid choosing sides for as long as possible before events forced them to declare allegiance or face consequences from whichever side controlled their locality. The revolution's success depended partly on patriots' ability to intimidate or suppress this large loyalist minority through methods that contradicted revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and consent, suggesting that the revolution was won as much through coercion as through popular enthusiasm for republican ideals. The American Revolution came closer to ending in British victory and colonial reabsorption than most patriotic histories acknowledge, with multiple moments when negotiated settlement or military collapse nearly returned the colonies to imperial control under terms that would have granted them greater autonomy within the empire, while preserving British sovereignty and avoiding the complete break that independence represented. General William Howe possessed both military superiority and authorization to negotiate peace terms with colonial leaders, reflecting British hope that military pressure, combined with offers of pardon and accommodation, might split the rebellion by peeling away moderates who had supported independence reluctantly and would abandon it if Britain offered acceptable terms for reconciliation. The Howe brothers, William commanding the army and Richard commanding the fleet, were themselves sympathetic to American grievances and personally opposed to the harsh suppression that hardliners in Parliament favoured, seeking throughout 1776 and 1777 to combine military operations with peace overtures that would end the rebellion through negotiation rather than conquest. They offered pardons to rebels who would lay down their arms, promised that Britain would not tax the colonies without their consent through their own assemblies, and suggested that some form of American representation in Parliament might be arranged to address colonial complaints about taxation without representation that had sparked the entire crisis. These peace offers failed partly because the Declaration of Independence had made colonial demands absolute and non-negotiable, requiring complete independence rather than reform within the empire, but also because British terms never went far enough to satisfy colonial requirements for self-governance and always demanded acknowledgement of parliamentary supremacy as precondition for any settlement. The conferences between Howe and American representatives in 1776 revealed the unbridgeable gap between positions. Britain insisted that colonists return to obedience before discussing grievances, while Americans insisted that Britain recognize their independence before they would discuss any relationship between the two nations. The American Revolution was not inevitable, destiny unfolding according to some predetermined historical logic, but contingency piled upon contingency, a series of decisions and accidents that could easily have turned out differently and produced outcomes ranging from continued colonial status within a reformed British Empire to catastrophic failure of the independence movement and brutal polity failure, suppression of revolutionary leadership. History appears inevitable only in retrospect, when we know how events actually unfolded and can construct narratives that make results seem natural consequences of prior causes. But people living through the revolution faced genuine uncertainty about outcomes at every stage and made decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain predictions about how Britain, France, and American populations would respond to revolutionary actions. The revolution succeeded because of factors that were not guaranteed and could have failed at numerous points. Washington's ability to keep an army in the field, despite repeated defeats and constant shortages of everything from ammunition to shoes. French willingness to commit resources to American independence, after Saratoga demonstrated that rebellion might actually succeed rather than collapse into easily suppressed chaos. British strategic blunders that dispersed forces across too many objectives and failed to coordinate campaigns in ways that might have destroyed Washington's army and ended organized resistance. And enough Americans choosing to support or at least tolerate revolution rather than remaining loyal or neutral in ways that would have undermined patriot control of colonial governance and military recruitment. If any of these factors had been different, if Washington had lost his army in one of the defeats that nearly destroyed it, if France had decided that supporting American rebellion was too risky or expensive, if British generals had pursued Washington more aggressively or coordinated their campaigns more effectively, if loyalist populations had been larger or better organized or more effective at resisting patriot intimidation, the revolution might have failed and colonial leaders would have faced execution for treason, while America returned to imperial control under conditions far harsher than those that existed before 1775. The revolution was a gamble, a leap into unknown futures that could have ended in disaster, undertaken by people who believed they had no choice but who could not know whether their cause would succeed, and who often doubted whether their sacrifices would be rewarded with the liberty they sought, or merely with martyrdom for a failed rebellion that history would remember as cautionary tale rather than founding myth. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.